you've got Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, now Ukraine and Iran. All I would say defeats because of failures of the thinking before the war. I mean, if we had done the thinking properly, I think it's likely that with one possible exception, we would have entered none of those wars because we would have realized that they were unwinnable. But I think at the moment, though, you have, and I've said this before as well, Glenn, that you have the Europeans in particular are fighting or supporting Ukraine according to a political narrative that they've constructed for themselves, whereas the Russians are fighting the war according to a military strategy. And surprise, surprise, the Russians are winning. And I think that at the moment, the political narrative is that actually, these strikes into Russia are working. Russia's now weak. The Russian economy is failing. There's no evidence for that, but that's what the political narrative is. And so you get into this circular cult thinking, and I can best describe it the way they seem to be operating. But the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, the EU, and NATO, to a lesser extent, I think the White House. I think Trump can go either way, and I suspect Vance will be thinking along the lines of you and I, and Hegseth and Rubio, along the lines of let's reinforce Europe and support this war. But actually, those who are thinking strategically, and I mean properly strategically, will surely come to the same conclusions as us because they're obvious. They're strategically obvious. I think that the open question is how it now plays out, and I think it will play out according to three timelines. I think the first timeline is how quickly will the E3 weapons be provided to Ukraine, because these weapons are not insignificant. And I'm talking about British weapons with warheads of 250 kilograms, and that's a significant warhead, and that's the sort of warhead which I suspect the Russians will be prepared to actually take action to prevent it being fired into Russia. I think the second question is how long is it before the White House realizes that, notwithstanding what Trump's been told in the G7, that actually the Russians aren't losing and that the Russian economy isn't failing, and that any effort that he puts into supporting this war is likely to lead to another defeat. I suspect that will want him to step back, especially as he's running into the midterms on the back of a first defeat. And the last thing I think will be for Putin, and Putin will be asking the question. He can see, no doubt, that because of the economic consequences of the self-defeating sanctions that the EU has placed on Russia, and now the accelerating problems on our energy networks because of the Straits of Hormuz, how long is it before the Europeans tip into a significant severe recession? And at that stage, how long is it before they actually say we can't afford this war? So, we better find a way out of this. That's an open question. But I think it's somewhere within those three timelines, we'll find there is the answer to how the war will play out strategically, Glenn. Not sure if I've answered your question, but be curious about what you think also about the timelines and how about it could play out.
Well, it's hard to imagine how this will play out. And again, on many areas you can look at the different variables and try to make some predictions. But with how this war would work, how it would be very difficult because it would spiral out of control so quickly, I think. And but no, if you look at the capabilities, then I don't think the Europeans would do very well at all. And I'm also suspecting that the Russians, while they do not have the same rhetoric of threatening dates of war with Russia, announcing this in advance, I assume that they're making preparations now. So the Oreshnik, for example, I assume that this is already into mass production, and this isn't necessarily aimed for primarily the Ukrainians. I think that is for the possibility of a war with NATO. And they've seen this over the past 4+ years. This is gradual incrementalism, escalation from from NATO, where they just do longer range missiles, more powerful, and at some point they know that what's going to happen. So I think they're already preparing for this. So no, I don't think we're ready for war at all. But I was curious though about what the U.S. involvement would be. That is, I think many assume that if there's a fight, then the Americans would, rush back in, and we'll go back to the glory days of the Cold War, or we would be joined by the hips again. But I suspect that the Europeans, we're no longer the center of the world, and as I say, if you don't have a seat at the table, you might be on the menu. And I think this might be the case. If a war breaks out, what would the Americans do? I keep thinking that perhaps they would treat the Europeans like we've treated the Ukrainians. That is, yes, you go fight the Russians. Good boys. Continue to do it. We'll send you the weapons. That's how we stand by you and support you. And you will have essentially your proxies bleeding themselves white, weakening an adversary. And I think the Europeans will become the new Ukrainians. But this time, of course, the Americans might even be more apprehensive, because this can very quickly spiral into nuclear exchange. And just to add, I think this is one of the most dangerous things of all is we're talking about a war with Russia. Usually would have a strategy. Then, okay, what does victory look like? How is it achieved? We have none of this. At least the first question: what does victory look like? If you're fighting the world's largest nuclear power, which considers itself to be in a fight for its existence, what does defeating it entail? What exactly do you want to achieve here? I mean, it's quite wild that this is not even a topic for discussion. It's just this emotional sloganeering.
No, I think this is a strategy, a subject close to my heart. I'm sort of getting my second edition of Strategy for Action sort of prepared. But actually, as you say, there is no evidence anywhere of any strategic thinking. What are the objectives? And at the moment, I would think that the implicit objectives, although they're not stated, of the actions that the Europeans are taking with sort of escalation through more weapons to Ukraine and supported by the United States. The implicit objectives are to bring the Russians back to the negotiating table. But actually, the Russians have already now made clear, now that Alaska has failed, and that all the other peace initiatives from which they were excluded were dead on arrival. I think the Russians have concluded that they can only achieve their objectives in Ukraine, which is what they will continue to go on and do militarily. I thought it was interesting that that Putin has actually talked about Novorossiya as well, which doesn't surprise me. It's something I've been speculating for about a year that might be the Russians' ultimate objectives. But I think the objectives, with unclear objectives and no obvious route to achieve them, which stops us getting into some escalatory situation. I can't think of a single strategy or any sort of plausible strategy that would allow us to achieve our objectives, whatever they are. Militarily, the Europeans don't have the power to achieve what they're seeking to achieve. I think coming back to the United States and what the United States would do, I think the United States, although initially there will be those who will be saying, let's support the Europeans, they will be very worried, I would think, of the risks of nuclear escalation. And they would be right to be worried as well. I mean, I don't think the Russians would not be the first people to pull the trigger, I don't think. The worry would be that France or Britain, one or other, actually decides to do so. I think that's unlikely. Nevertheless, the consequences were it to happen would be profound. So I think that the American situation might be initially to sort of say, yes, we'll please now be the new Ukrainians, so we want you to fight Russia. But after a bit, when they see the destruction that's being wrought on the European economy and the breakdown of European society, I think they would have rapid second thoughts. I think a lot of people in the United States, possibly apart from neocons, would be horrified at seeing what was happening to Europe. So I would like to think that the Americans, stand fast, the neocons, would be pretty reluctant after a bit. I think one of the things that also strikes me, Glenn, is that when you think about scenarios like this, people will often say, well, of course, the Russians wouldn't do this because we passed all their red lines and they've just ignored them. I simply don't agree with that. I mean, they had two critical red lines, which have been said repeatedly to us for the past 20 years, which is that if NATO expands into Georgia and or Ukraine, then we will respond. And in both times, when there's been the threat of NATO expanding into first Georgia, the Russians responded, and then Ukraine, the Russians have responded. So actually, I think, on these red lines, don't for one moment think that the Russians wouldn't respond a third time, because I think they would. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. And it does to me bring up the alternative pathway, which is the issue of diplomacy. I mean, it's clear to me that in NATO, which I've said before, is not the omnipotent force, even with America on board, that so many people think. I mean, again, as I've said before, if NATO couldn't defeat the Taliban, why do we think it could defeat Russia? So to me, the bit of the jigsaw that's missing is diplomacy. Can we not get back to diplomacy? And I'm not saying it's going to be an easy diplomacy, but surely, in the light of these plausible risks to Europe and to Europeans, or the Europeans not to be the ones who are actually starting to think about talking to Russia as opposed to the United States, is this not something that the E3 could do? Is this not something that the European Union could do, difficult though it would be? I mean, there's no sense of this at the moment, but there should be a sense. And I think one of the key things that we should be doing is we should be, we the people, because it's we the people who will be asked to fight this war and to bear its consequences. We should be having a national debate about this. It's your point, is that any debate is closed off because it's seen as sort of supporting Russia or being, a Putin supporter, or as I see it, as having a critical debate about something which is strategically and has the potential to be strategic, existential to Europeans. We don't want to destroy European society, so why can we not think of at least talk about a plan B, where we can start to talk about to the Russians about what they want, and start to talk about the possibility of an alternative strategic architecture in Europe. Again, it's not easy at the moment, but surely we should be having these conversations, Glenn. And surely we should be inviting, or at least asking, our leaders to actually talk about why it is that they won't have discussion with Russia, and why that we, the people, are not being we're not being asked for our views on whether we are happy to go to war with Russia, because I suspect the vast majority of the people in Europe won't be happy. But over to you, Glenn. I don't know what you think from your part of Europe.